recording on now. All right. All right, so I just wanted to start off with the purpose of the program. So again, Christy Lovelace, I am with the Surface Water Utility at the City of Shoreline. The Surface Water Utility is responsible for managing rainwater as it falls throughout the city. So really what we're doing is we are working to prevent flooding throughout the city. And we're also trying to reduce the impacts to our natural waterways, our streams, lakes, and Puget Sound as rainwater from urban areas makes its way back to those natural waterways. So most of you are familiar with storm drains over here. I hope on the left that you've seen these. Really important PSA, these are not sewers, these are storm drains. They're meant for collecting rainwater. And this is, it's a useful infrastructure for preventing flooding. It's also old infrastructure. So when rainwater flows into these, it flows directly out to the nearest waterway through these piped systems. And so part of our goal as a new mindset for infrastructure is really to reduce the amount of water that's flowing into storm drains and flowing into ditches and then straight out into our natural waterways. And that's because as rainwater flows through urban areas, it picks up a lot of different pollution. So we always say only rain down the storm drain, and we really mean only rain down the storm drain. Pollution comes from so many different sources. And the problem is that in urban areas, it's picking it up from really large areas and it's concentrating it. So when it goes back out into the streams, it's taking with it a lot of materials that are really harmful for fish and wildlife, and for us if we're in the streams as well. Some really common examples, some that you might have heard of, are pet waste. So encouraging folks to always pick up that pet waste to keep fecal bacteria out of streams. We've got car leaks and even car wash soap as well. Car wash soap, even if it's biodegradable, can still be really harmful to fish. So biodegradable actually requires that it goes through the earth first in order to degrade. So when it runs off of hard surfaces and goes straight into storm drains, it doesn't have that opportunity, and it can really harm fish and other aquatic wildlife. From our landscapes, fertilizers, and outdoor cleaning materials as well. So really, only rainwater down the drain is what we're looking for. Another issue that can happen is that when water flows into these, because it's coming from such a large area, it's really high volumes that are coming out into these pipes. And so it can cause erosion and damage our streams. So for these reasons, we're really looking to reduce the amount of water that enters the roadway in the first place and enters storm drains and ditches, and really trying to get water to return to a more natural water cycle. And that's why we have the Soak It Up program. So in our natural environment, so pre-development, what we had was these nice forested lands, and rainwater would fall onto those lands. And in most places, it would soak into the ground. It would return to groundwater resources, and then it would slowly return back to those natural waterways. And in doing this, it would also supply water during the drier months. So it would allow streams and lakes and Puget Sound, I mean, Puget Sound always has water, but streams and lakes particularly, to see water during those summer months as well and keep those flows well established. When water goes through the earth, it also helps to remove some pollutants, which is really great. We do have pollutants in our urban environment, and we can use that system to help remove some of those pollutants. And that's what rain gardens and native landscaping can help with. So it's reducing those heavy flows. It's allowing, more natural summer and spring flows through groundwater resources, and it is reducing pollution. And so that's our interest in offering this program, is we want to help residents to return to that natural cycle. There's lots of public spaces where we're doing this work, but we know that it's going to also take these changes on private property in order to really meet our goals and reduce pollution in our natural waterways. So again, our goals for today, I had mentioned this earlier, but we really want to give you the skills on how to design, build, and maintain rain gardens and native landscaping. And this is the first step. I'll be sharing eligibility information for the Soak It Up rebate program and giving you more information on how you can participate if you are interested. And then we will be answering your specific questions that you might have about your site, or just issues that you're running into, just to make this process a bit easier for you. And now I would like to hand it on over to Laura. Oh, Laura, you're muted right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us tonight. I know we're getting into spring and people are anxious to spend any time they can outside. Hopefully this will give you a little bit of a feel of being outdoors. We're going to talk a lot about soil and water and plant choices and how landscapes function when they're healthy, so that we can keep our waterways clean around Puget Sound. We're going to talk about rain gardens first. So I want to describe what a rain garden is. It's a beautiful enhanced feature in your garden, which has specific types of plants that are planted in a shallow, relatively speaking, bowl. So it's a depressed area in the garden that's designed to hold water for a short period of time, and then the water drains out. So water comes from the roof or the road or wherever you're trying to direct it from. That's an impervious surface, and it runs into the garden, and the garden is enhanced with specific soil types. And then it can slowly percolate through that soil like a wetland would function. So we're kind of engineering these little mini wetlands in our gardens. And then the water disperses slowly so that it doesn't overwhelm the storm drain system. And it also doesn't overflow everywhere. And they're created in such a way as to prevent all of that from happening. So we're going to look at how they're created. There is some engineering that happens, some math that happens, and we'll take each section at a time to talk about it. So next. So the Rain Garden Handbook, which I have my handy dandy copy of right here, is a fabulous resource for you. This was developed through WSU, Washington State University Extension. Curtis Hinman was fabulous lead on this project. And it is this complete handbook for you to use to design, install, and maintain a rain garden on your property. It has all the things you need to know, how to calculate everything you need to calculate, how to choose plants, why it works. Really great resource. We're really, really lucky to have that. Next. So in this overview of rain gardens, we're going to look at how to size them, where to site them, excavating the ground, how to add the soil and what is that soil, what inlets emergency overflows are, and why they matter. As I said, this is an engineered feature in a garden. And then how to plant them and how to maintain the beautiful plants. And we're looking at some beautiful checker mallow here, which is a fantastic native plant. So when we size the rain garden, the first thing you're thinking about is where are you pulling water from that is going to go into this rain garden. In this image, which comes out in Rain Garden Handbook, you can see that they're looking at a rooftop and they're looking at some impervious surfaces as well. You want to take those surfaces, you're going to rechannel them, they're going to be redirected into these shallow depressions filled with specialized soil and beautiful plants. And that's going to divert that water from just falling off the roof and going down downspouts into storm drains, or in the case of like concrete surfaces, just running into the street. So you are actually reusing the water for good use to make it be functional on your property. Next. So here are the factors that we think about and we need to use when we're sizing a rain garden. You need to know what your contributing area is, and you're going to be looking at square footage of that. The infiltration rate, so how long it takes the water to disappear from your rain garden, and then your ponding area depth, or how deep this bowl, the shallow bowl, is in your yard. Next. All right, so contributing area. This is the square feet of the hard space. So it's a square footage of your rooftop. It's a square footage of any kind of impervious surface, driveway, patio, whatever that you have that you feel could contribute to a rain garden. And there are different measuring tools that you're going to use. You can use measuring wheels or ropes. There is a King County parcel viewer. It's an aerial tool where you can look at your parcel from the air and see and measure. And then the Soak It Up staff, Christy specifically, is available to help you with that. So if you have questions about how to do that, if you decide to do this program, or even if you just decide to build a rain garden, you can be helped with that math. Next, the infiltration rate. So this is super important. You need to know that, first of all, where you dig a hole in the ground that you're going to divert a whole bunch of water to. And remember, when it rains hard, there's a lot of water coming down out of the sky. So you are trying to divert all of that flow into this shallow bowl, but it has to drain. And we want it to drain rather quickly. We don't want it sitting for days. We want it to drain out, and 24-hour period is ideal to see it be moving. Because we're not building ponds, even though we talk about ponding area. The ponding area is just for the rain event where the water will fill up. So infiltration rate is a measure of how fast that water drains out of the hole. And basically you're going to do a test where you dig a 2-foot hole and you put a ruler in there, and then you fill 12 inches of water in the hole. And then you're going to calculate that rate by figuring out how long it takes for that water to drain in the hole and divide by the total inches by the total hours that it took. Now, some sandy soils are going to drain very quickly. If you have very clay soil, a lot of hard pan, it's going to drain very slowly. And there are sometimes areas where a rain garden doesn't work very well. The Soak It Up program folks will come out and actually help you with this to review at least what you found out about your infiltration rate. Okay, next. And then the ponding area depth, 6 inches or 12 inches, is how deep you're going to make this. Now, the ponding area, you're going to dig a deeper hole than what you're going to end up with, because you're going to fill this with specialized soil. So the ponding area is partially an aesthetics choice, mostly. Do you want a shallower or deeper garden? But it could have ramifications to what size garden you have. Maybe you only have enough square footage to make a certain size garden, so it needs to be a little deeper in order to handle the water that's coming into it. If you have a deeper garden, that's going to mean you have a smaller surface area of the garden. And then once these are filled in, you're not going to notice one way or the other. They're going to look like a garden, fully planted garden feature. Okay, next. So this rain garden sizing chart is in the handbook. And basically what you're looking at is you're picking the region of rainfall when shoreline is region 2. And you can see that that's been outlined here on the chart for you in this PowerPoint. And you're going to decide whether it's 6 inches or 12 inches. And then you're going to take your infiltration test results, which are going to be somewhere in these ranges here, about how many inches per hour that water drains. So 0.25 to 0.49, so 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And then you're going to come down to region 2. And in the better section for this program, it's required that you use better or best. And if you can't use better, then you have to move to best. So the better range for 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch is 14%. And that's your infiltration rate. So these are sizing factors that you're using to help you decide how big that garden needs to be to handle the volume of water and how fast it's draining. Okay, next. So it feels like a lot of math. Fortunately, most of it's done for you. You have that chart, which helps you figure it out easily. And really what you have to know is square footage of your the property, and then the infiltration rate. So you are taking those two pieces, those two numbers, and you are multiplying them to get a square footage result. And that lets you know how big that garden needs to be. And then you can design it however wide or long or you need it to be to fit the space that you have. So you're going to end up with a number that says you need a garden that's 62 square feet, and then you figure out how big the sides are, how long it's going to be, and you fit it into the space where you're going to be diverting water to. The overflow containment area is a specialized additional 1 foot of horizontal garden soil around all of the sides, which raises it up a little higher in order to prevent big overflows from happening. And we'll look at all of this a little bit more here in a second. So in the rain garden handbook too, you can think about how to create different shapes, and it helps you do the math to figure out, since you're not looking just at a square or rectangle, which is easy to do square footage on. They help you to figure out how to calculate that and get to your desired square footage. So in this case, they were looking for 392 square feet, and they've calculated that based on a rectangular shape with these little overflow areas, because this is a more fluid and circular design. Okay, next. So there are some rules. These are important. So you need to be 10 feet from a foundation, because you do not want to compromise your house or your neighbor's house. You don't want it flooding into your basement, and you don't want it to erode your foundations. You don't want to put this over utility lines. So it's important to call 811 to have your utilities marked in your property, any kind of underground utilities. And you want to put it outside tree drip lines where less roots are, and you don't want to damage roots of trees, because you can harm a tree, and then you are doing yourself a disservice, because now you don't have that feature in your garden, which also helps to manage rainwater. It needs to be 50 feet back from a slope, which is 10% in grade or greater. And this is also because of erosion. It can, if you can imagine a big rain event, and especially if it hasn't been, the sides haven't been built up enough, or you didn't put a overflow area onto it, you're going to have some water that will overflow, and it could run down that hillside. And then whoever's at the bottom of that hill would be impacted by it as well. When you do provide overflow from the garden, you need to direct it onto your own property, ideally, so that it can just fan out. So it could go across a lawn, for instance, and just soak in. Okay, next. So you're going to decide to excavate, and you can see in this photo the different colored, and many of you have probably done this before. You can see the colored marks on the ground that are showing different kinds of utility lines that are underground where they are. Obviously, there's a lot of things in this area, maybe not the best place to dig, but definitely call, and that 811 number will help you locate your utilities. They'll come out and do it on your property. So this is a big rain garden being laid out. You can use markers to place your forms, so you can see what the shape of this is going to look like, decide how you want it. Now, there is nothing wrong with doing a square or a rectangle, except for curves look better in a natural setting and a garden setting. So in this case, they're making a few curves with a little bit of a point on one end here. But this is one way to do it. You put stakes in the ground and put the colored tape around it. You could use rope, you could use string, whatever works. I've seen some people do this with hoses, laying hoses out on the ground so they can mark it. But the problem with hoses is you want them to be old and disposable, because when you bring equipment in, you could damage anything you put on the site. Next. So you can do this with little mini excavators. And that's really great if you have a lot of concrete to remove too. So one of the goals of this program, of course, is to remove impervious surfaces and build a rain garden, or do some natural landscaping, which we'll talk about a little later. You can use friends with shovels, or if you're, just putting a small one in yourself and you're good and strong and hardy, it doesn't take long to do one yourself if it's a smaller space. But you can also hire people, of course, to help you dig. But the goal is to get this done properly and make sure that you've got the measurements right, and you're digging and putting the soil where it's safe to put it as you dig. So extra soil's coming out because what you're doing in this case is improving the soil that's in the garden by replacing it. Some people do in building rain gardens just improve the soil that's coming out of the rain garden. But for this program, I think they're asking you, Christy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, to replace your soil so that they know that you have the right type of permeable soil that's created specifically for these projects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Laura, just really quickly. In many cases, it is excavating and replacing with the rain garden soil blend. But there are situations where the water is infiltrating really quickly and the soil is looking pretty healthy. There's already a lot of composted material in which you can just continue to amend the soil. So it's a site-by-site thing, and I'll help you determine that through the application process.
And we'll talk about the soil too in a second and why it matters, why it's different. But you're going to build your berm around your rain garden. You can use that excavated soil to do that. You can use it at other sites in the yard. You can add compost to the soil you're digging out. You could create a vegetable garden, build some raised beds somewhere. And usually when you're pulling topsoil out of the ground, and a lot of times soil and housing areas where developments have gone in isn't the top-notch soil that you would grow a veggie garden in. So you definitely want to amend that. Sometimes neighbors need it for projects they're doing. I know I've seen it at Lister and Craigslist, and then there's places to actually pay to take it if you need to. Next. So here's the options. Excavate and replace soil. So this is your number one option. And as Christy said, you can excavate and amend soil for reuse. If you have really well-drained soil, if you have very sandy soil, it's important to put compost into it because the compost helps to grab the anything that's coming off your roof or off that pavement and hold it in place. If it's sandy, it's just going to run right through it, and the water will continue carrying those pollutants out into the groundwater, into the areas around and into the storm drain. So it's important to have the right kind of soil mix in here depending on how you do it. Before you dig, you need to decide how deep it's going to be, and then how much soil mix you're going to put in there. So you're doing these calculations, how big it's going to need to be with square footage. Now, how deep is that ponding depth going to be? Is it 6-inch or 12-inch? And then how much soil then do you need to go back into it? So even if you are amending your soil, you need to mix that soil and put it back in again. Okay. So here's an example of an excavated site. You can see on the right top where there's a drain pipe coming off the house, and this is going to be there's going to be some piping attached to this that will go into that channel and ditch that's being built. And that's where the water is going to flow. And then that's going to go into the pond, which will be filled, the ponding area, which will be filled with the specialized soil. And then you're going to have an outlet on the other end that's going to be for overflow. And we'll talk about that too. Next. So what is rain garden soil? So as I said, it's specialized. And one of the reasons it's specialized is that it has a lot more compost in it than we generally would recommend for putting into any typical garden. And that's because we want the compost. Compost helps to hold water, has great water retention capacity, and it has a lot of nutrients, but it also traps a lot of toxins. The organic matter traps the toxins in place. And so you are essentially keeping them at bay from moving out of the rain garden. Next. So rain garden mix is usually like 60% sand, 40% compost. In a typical garden setting, organic matter is recommended to be about 5% tops. So this is a lot more. You can get these mixes in the Northwest. We are blessed with, people like Curtis, who created this wonderful rain garden handbook and helped advise on these things, and companies who follow suit, who want to participate. So we do have companies that actually create these rain garden soil blends. And if you are doing your own mix on site, then there's lots of compost in the region to buy to add to your soil. So it's very available. Getting that approved bioretention soil, is wonderful because it helps you know that you've got the right thing. You're putting in about 12 to 24 inches of rain garden soil blend. And this has, there's going to be a slower infiltration the more soil you have in there. As I said, that slows the water down and it helps to trap it because the compost kind of sucks the water up. When you're creating these, you also want to make sure that you're putting the soil along the slopes, and you want to create gentle slopes. You don't want these to be sharp. What you're seeing when they're excavating is a sharp edge, but you're going to end up with a graded edge, which is fanned out and more shallow than that. And those are also areas you're going to plant, as you're going to see. Next. So the inlet, as I pointed out in that other slide, is where water's coming from. So in this picture, water's coming off a roof, and you can see a couple of places where it's coming in. In one place, there's a rock channel where it's coming through, and another one, there's a pipe underground. There's different ways to do this, but it needs to flow to the rain garden. And so in order for it to flow too, there has to be a little bit of a slope for it to move downhill into the garden. So you want to make sure that 100% of the water from your hard surface is flowing into the rain garden. So whatever you've determined to be your contributing factor. But there's a lot of ways to be creative with this that they're functional, but they can become decorative and have an aesthetic feature as well. Next. So hard PVC pipe is your pipe of choice. You don't want to use flexible pipe that's going to break down over time. You can see the end of it sticking out here. This is coming off this downspout underground. This rock channel helps to protect the pipe, and it also adds, in case there's overflow, area for water to drain through it. But typically the water just comes straight through it and into the rain garden. And it's hard to see in this picture, but there is slight slope into the basin here. The sedges that you see in the bottom, these grassy plants like water. And so we'll talk about plants too, but they are what you would see in the bottom. So there is a slight slope there. Next picture. And then here's another version where the water is just going directly into this rock line channel. In this case, it's been lined with like pond liner underneath and then rocks put on top of it. This is a nice feature. It's a little more maintenance and upkeep because you have to keep these very clean in order for the water to run smoothly and not pile up a bunch of stuff that's eroding through, any leaves that gather and, comes down into the rain garden and kind of blocks the entry of water into the rain garden. Next. So you need an outlet too. You need this emergency overflow. You can see the slight ponding in here. Basically, the water comes in and fills this bowl and then slowly disperses. But if we have a huge storm that can't handle the volume of water that's coming off the roof, and usually these are built to handle what's customary, but you can build them to handle a little bit more water than you might expect, so you don't have to worry quite as much about that, but you still need an overflow. In this case, it's going out onto the lawn around the garden so that it's not going to be disturbing anything. But just make sure where you're directing that outflow that it's not going somewhere that's going to be problematic. Not going into the neighbor's basement, not going into your basement, not going in right directly across the sidewalk, that sort of thing. Okay, next. All right, so here is the overflow containment area I mentioned before. This is an extra space to capture water that rises above the ponding level during those extreme storms, which we do get from time to time. So basically, we're looking at a little engineering schematic here, but what it is just providing more horizontal space, a horizontal vertical space. It's a little confusing to explain it that way, but you're expanding the sides, the horizontal frame of the garden with vertical depth, so that the water has more area to fill, and typically won't fill that on a normal rain event, but in a storm it could. And then still you need to make sure that that overflow is protected. Next. So this is an example. So you can see sort of the rougher edges. This is high water here. You could see at the far end where it's coming in, it's pretty high. But you need to make sure that you're not compromising the outflow. The outflow still needs to be low enough to dispel water from the rain garden. Next. So you can build these berms around your garden, especially if you're on a slope. And you can get help with the siting if you need this in the site that you're trying to, hoping to put your rain garden in. So Christy and the staff can help you decide if berms need to be built. But basically, you're trying to raise the level of the original grade, but also have maintain a little bit of slope to this. So here's part of what that looks like. So you have this. Can we go back real quick to the other picture? You have a slope. You're digging part of that out. Okay, and let's go back to the next one. But you're putting that around the edges to create a berm. And you can see there's still a slight slope in this picture, but this is your finished grade that you're shooting for. This dotted line is where the original grade would be if it was flat land. And you're designing sort of as if it's flat land and then creating berms on either side to be able to contain that water. Your ultimate goal is to have a flat bottom on these, whether it's on a slope or on a flat space. And a berm on the downhill side is helping you to, here's your original little hill. This is helping you to stop the water from just rushing out of it. So I'm going to recap a couple of the terms just so I know there's a lot of terminology here. So the ponding area is the depth of the rain garden that's going to be after you've excavated and filled with soil. And so this is the excavated piece. Imagine this filled with soil. That's going to be your ponding depth. And that's where the water diverted from the hardscapes collects. Your emergency overflow is that outlet on the opposite end of a rain garden. And then usually on the opposite end from where the inlet is. Sometimes they're not exactly directly opposite each other, but basically it's on the other side and typically has a little bit of a downhill slope to it. It's lower than the inlet so that the water can drain out properly. And again, this is useful for when we have ponding that happens as the rain's happening. So the goal is once the rain stops falling, this is going to just soak into the ground. And it is soaking in partially while the rain is happening, except that the rain's happening faster than it can absorb. And the overflow containment area is that just extra special touch to make sure you have more of this space that's higher around the garden, but it widens the garden space. It gives you more places to plant too, and it gives you more area for the water to pool temporarily. Okay, next. So this is the funnest part, of course, of a rain garden and why many people want to do it. Planting it. Planting a rain garden is super fun, and we're going to go through the different zones that you see in a garden. So you have zone 1, which is where I was talking about. You saw the sedges. This is the flat bottom, the ponding area. These are plants that can handle standing in water. And also our Northwest natives are used to being dry in the summer. So these plants also can tolerate a little bit of drought. because in the summertime, your goal isn't to pour a bunch of water on this. This is supposed to be a natural garden that handles its own. And so you're going to have plants in the bottom that can stand in water for a while. Remember, we're not talking about a pond. It's not going to be days. It's just hours that we're talking about. And then, but the soil stays wet. And then in the summertime, it dries out. And then you have zone 2, where you have plants that can occasionally be in water, because if that ponding gets high, they're going to be affected. The soil will be wetter there. And then in zone 3, you have those drier conditions, which is, you know, lots of other plants. So the beautiful thing about this is that you have this huge diversity of plants that can be planted in here. And that's one of the reasons it looks so beautiful. Next. The Rain Garden Manual has fabulous charts. It talks about whether they're native or not, plants are native or not, what kind of sunlight they need. So, you know, when you're thinking about where you're placing your rain garden, it might be partially sunny and partially shady. It might be all out in the sun, or it might be all in the shade. And you can check these the manual to see what kind of conditions your plants like. It also tells you which area, so 1, 2, and 3, whether, so a chorus, the sweet flag doesn't mind being standing in water. Some of these other ones don't mind a little bit of water. But some of them would prefer, like the yarrow. We know yarrow to be a drought tolerant plant. It likes that top layer. So you're looking at these numbers to determine where they go in the garden, and then whether or not they are evergreen or deciduous, and what kind of light they like. Some of them are gonna be taller than others. So you have a lot of variety in size and shape of plants. And then when they bloom, if they have noticeable blooms. And then there's an extra section here about special unique features, like they attract insects and butterflies, which yarrow does. Yarrow is a fabulous beneficial insect plant. So you can design based on those kinds of features as well. Next. So when you're choosing plants, you don't want to pick really, really big shrubs, which will sort of overgrow the garden. You want this to stay functional. You don't want anything to dominate it. You want it to be a good collection of plants that still allows the rain that's entering to pond and disperse. You want to put your tree, if you put trees into this, you want to put them into the higher levels. And then you really want to avoid plants that spread. A lot of plants that reproduce vegetatively have underground stems, rhizomes that run through these. And the problem with that is they can dominate the plant selection. So you can put a lot of beautiful plants in, and then one plant will take over. So you don't want to have that happen. If you are going to put edible plants in, you should choose zones 1 and 2, and put them up where there's fewer toxins. So the toxins are collecting in the lower part of the soil. So just put them up in the higher parts around the edges. Next. So you can see a lot of sample planting plans. So you can adopt one that's already in there that shows you all the different sizes. This is a large rain garden where you can put trees that are going to grow large. You can see where the inflow is coming in and the outflow is, and then the different zones that are in here. And in this case, there's a larger zone 1 and a smaller zone 2, and larger zone 3, excuse me, and a larger zone 2. And then zone 1 is kind of your average sort of flat bottom size. Next. So when you're done planting, you have to mulch this garden. Mulch actually helps the garden work. Mulch will protect the rain garden soil that you've put in. It helps to keep it intact and keeps it from compacting, keeps it from eroding. You want to put mulch in also because it's going to help you with weeding. So when the garden's new, there will be more weeding activity than when it's starting to fill in. The goal for a rain garden is to get it to fill in with these beautiful plants so that there's relatively little weeding that has to go on. And then mulch also moderates soil temperature, so it keeps it warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. And this is important for keeping plants healthy and less stressed. And wood chip mulch has a lot of nutrients in it too. It decomposes slowly, and it helps with the soil quality. So if you imagine, we always talk about that these things decompose and they add to the structure of soil. One of the reasons that happens is because all the soil organisms are actually using this. They're eating on it and they're breaking it down and they're moving it through the soil. So they actually do that work for you just by placing it on top of the soil. Okay, next. Super important to maintain. So you need to make sure that it's draining properly. If you have issues with that, then you need to troubleshoot. And Christy, I'm sure, can help you figure out, what might be the problem, what might have gone wrong. You don't want any erosion happening. You want to maintain your soil mulch in place. You need to water these plants for the first few years. Most plants need to get established. Got to replenish that mulch from time to time. You got to keep those weeds down until it's filled in. Okay. So keep your gutters clean, because the stuff that's coming into the garden, it'll get all clogged up. And then you aren't going to have a clean flow of water coming through. So the point is to make sure there's nothing in your gutters that's going to clog up that the piping that's coming into the garden. You can put screens in place where the gutter meets the downspout to keep stuff out. And you need to remove debris that's building up in the inlets or at the overflows. And you will see this happen. It can happen just naturally, even sometimes based on what plants you put in. So when you're thinking about planting too, it's some consideration to think about where your inlet and outlet is. You may not want to put the biggest, leafiest, deciduous thing right above that, because you're going to be dealing with having to clean those leaves out of there. You want to cut back plants that are growing over these areas or into those areas. And that, again, is another good reason why you don't want a lot of plants that spread by underground stem. And then if you want to check to make sure it's draining, even outside the rainy season while things are growing, test it, put a hose up there and get water running through the system and see what happens. Next. So watering is important, especially for the first 2 to 3 years. Our summers are dry. Typically we have this kind of wispy June with cool weather, but that isn't always happening anymore. And as we saw with the heat dome last June, that was pretty disastrous. A lot of trees and shrubs got burned from the sun, the heat, and the direct sun on them. It was a very unusual event. But June is important, our mistiness, but you still have to pay attention to whether things are being watered naturally or not. So usually May through September is when you're paying attention to watering, especially July, August, and the first part of September. That's usually when we get our hottest, driest weather. You want to water at the base of plants so that you're not getting the leaves all wet. That's ideal, especially on a hot sunny day, because that can also burn. Water can magnify the sun going through it. But you put it at the base of the plant. It also helps to reduce disease issues, and watering in the morning is ideal, or you can do it in the evening, especially if you're watering at the base of the plant. But watering in the midday, there's more wind, so more loss of water to drift and more evaporation because it's hotter out. So morning and evening, couple of years, let things get grown in, they'll start shading the soil, and that mulch will help as well. And of course, we're not seeing mulch in this picture. You would mulch this over those soaker hoses. Okay, next. So the first summer, check every 3 to 4 days. If you're getting rainy days, you still want to check, because water may not be penetrating as deep as the root system is, and you may just be getting a little bit of water shallow, which isn't helping you develop a deep root system. It's important for any plant in the Northwest to develop a deep root system to maintain itself over the summer. But check it every 3 to 4 days. Means water it deeply. Don't just give it a little bit, water it deeply. And then in 3 to 4 days, check again and see if you need to. Every 2 weeks in the second summer, be checking. And then in the third summer, once a month. Beyond that, you may not need to water at all, but as I said, our summers are getting a little more problematic. You might need to do a deep soak once. There are some plants on my parking strip which are very drought tolerant, and I usually give them one really deep soaking, some rosemary and evergreen magnolia, and actually the Japanese maple, which does pretty well. But the rosemary even asks for some water at least once a year. So one time, maybe, if we're getting a long, dry, hot summer. Next.
Laura, can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
I know that there's been a lot of discussion around with our increasingly dry and hot summers, how these recommendations are changing. And I am curious, is there any temperature thresholds? Like if it's been, you know, a high enough temperature for several days that you would want to maybe consider watering more frequently than once every 2 weeks or once a month as this is laid out?
It's a really good question. You know, when we had that heat dome, it was interesting to see what happened in the plants in my yard, because certain plants were more affected than others. And I was watering every day, you know, just to make sure that the water was soaking in. And then I think some of the plants, it didn't matter because it was just the sun on the leaves was damaging them and they were fully hydrated. So in an unusual situation like that, there's not a lot you can do. That's sort of like, you know, a furnace blasting on them. But I did notice that things like hydrangeas would wilt in the middle of the day and then perk back up again when it got cooler. So you can watch what your plants are doing, especially if we have unusual weather. But I would say I think part of it is timing. So June, things are expanding, leaves are very tender, they're not hardened off, so they're not tolerant to a lot of heat and a lot of dry weather because they're transpiring too much. They're losing all their water because they don't have a waxy coating to protect them. When they get in July and August, when plants are fully formed, you know, they're a little more tolerant. So even if we get 100 and something degrees, they're going to tolerate it better than they did in that June weather we had. So it's partially timing, type of plant, basically water deeply, anything you water, and check your soil. Make sure it's going down into the root zones of plants.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so when you're replenishing mulch, you want to at least keep 2 inches of mulch on the soil. Woody mulch is like arbor's chips, shredded wood mulch. You can get this through multiple vendors in this area. You can get on Chip Drop and get it delivered. You can talk to arborists if you see them in your area. I've actually had good luck with that when I've seen arborists working in my area, to just say, hey, do you have a home for those already? And they will deliver them, but be aware they're going to deliver a lot. You don't want to use beauty bark, partly because it floats a little bit more, for one thing. It doesn't absorb water very well. It's like wood chips are wood. They're actually, you know, the living part of the living tissue in the container, the compartmentalized wood of a tree, and they can absorb moisture. So they're not going to just float away. Bark is by nature made to protect trees from fire, insect, water, all that stuff. So it's just not the thing you want to put on the ground to be a nutritious product that can help hold water in place and help stay down and keep your weeds down. So wood chips are ideal. And as I said, you can find them lots of places. So next. You do need to weed, stay on top of weeds too, because, you know, they spread fast. And this is a really enriched soil. They're going to spread real fast in here. So you want to be aware of that. Don't let them get a foothold. Stay on top of it. That mulch will help a lot, especially that 2-inch level. Weeds can choke out young plants. Some of the things you put in here are going to be small. There'll be little ground covers, perhaps in some of the edging areas. And you want to be able to keep them growing healthily and let them have the space and not have, you know, weeds that tend to outcompete them grow there. you want to remove the entire weed. So in the case of something like a dandelion or the cat's ear or anything that in the daisy family, the lettuce family that looks like this, chicory has leaves that look similar to this when it starts to grow, the basal growth, they have a taproot. So you're trying to get down. You can use like a hoe like this. You can use hori-hori knives. There are dandelion diggers. There's long-handled pruners with prongs that go over the crown of the plant, and you can pop them out of the ground. This works really well when it's wet to get the entire weed out. You may often leave a little piece behind, but the more often you do it, the more you're starving the plant, because it needs the sunlight to create sugars through photosynthesis in the green leaves. So if you can keep those green leaves at bay, you're going to get rid of the weed. And don't use herbicides and weed killer. That's, you know, contradictory to what you're trying to do here. You're trying to have a space where you're sequestering toxins from pollutants from getting into our waterways. So using herbicides and weed killer just adds pressure to that system. It's not necessary either in most cases. There's nothing that is going to be out of your control. And then a thick mulch layer will help. Now, I do want to say when you're putting mulch in, be sure, if you're putting woody plants in, be sure to keep the mulch a little bit away from the trunk of the tree. So a few inches away, so you're not smothering the base of the tree. Okay. So this is in the book too, this is a great maintenance schedule to sort of think about when your tasks are. Like any garden, you know, there are things that need to happen at certain times. And what I like about this too is that other than that, well, maintain drainage actually can work in a regular garden, but this is a good garden care calendar in general. Like these are when you should be doing these tasks. So weeding, I would actually put a dot in the fall section too, because there are some fall weeds that come back when it's cooler that are similar to what grows in the spring. Maintaining drainage, you know, you want to make sure that during the rainy season, when you need this thing to be functional, that you are still checking to make sure nothing's clogging up the inlet or outlet on the rain garden. And that, you know, you maintaining drainage is important for any part of your yard. I have a lawn that is soaking wet in the winter. I cannot walk on it. Actually, when we had that snow this year, I went to put a suit block out for the birds in and got stuck in the mud under the snow because my grass gets so wet. So next. Are we going into native landscaping now?
Yep.
Looks like. Do you want to take a short break? Do people want to do that?
Yeah, let's give everybody just a 2-minute break to stretch legs and grab a drink of water if they need to, and then we will jump back in. So thank you so much, Laura. That was the overview and the walk, not really an overview, really the walkthrough of the rain garden portion, which is one of the gardens we offer in the rebate program. And so when we come back in 2 minutes, we'll talk about the native landscaping and the rebate for that.
Great.
All right, Laura, are you there?
I am.
Perfect. Let's go ahead and jump back to it.
I wanted to make one more comment about maintenance. You don't need to go back to that slide though. In the handbook, there's this fabulous also maintenance checklist. So if you're, needing to think, what are all the things I need to do? It's all written out for you, which is really cool. And it talks about all the different things that you need to be paying attention to. One of which we didn't mention, is making sure that there's integrity in the side slopes in the garden, making sure that that's staying intact. Okay, so let's talk about another way you can sequester stormwater. As Christy pointed out, we have, native landscapes in the Northwest before we built things all over the place, where we took the native landscapes out and put concrete in instead. They used to do the job of soaking up the rainwater. So the goal of native landscaping is to increase soil's ability to absorb rainwater again. So we're kind of replacing what was in our own yards and gardens. And if more of us do this, this is always better for the environment we all live in. We're trying to reduce runoff. So the less impervious surfaces you have on your property, the better. And we're trying to get the rainwater to return back to groundwater naturally, so that it can actually help take care of the plants around it and not overwhelm our storm drain systems. There are a lot of, it's interesting. We've done a lot of work at Tilth Alliance on stormwater work over the years in different ways. And we work with the City of Seattle and their Rainwise program, which also does this. And there are a lot of combined sewer overflows in Seattle. They combine the sewers with the storm drains. And so you can imagine when they get overfilled, that's not only just the street and rooftop toxins and pollutants, but stuff that's coming out of your sewage from your house going into the water around it. But we did a map one time to show where the overflows were, and then also overlaid on that a layer of where wildlife in the city is. And it's often in those same areas where there are these overflow areas. So in any place, even if it's just water coming off the street or your rooftop, there's still pollutants there. A lot of pollutants come off of cars. There's a lot of metals that come out of our brake pads, and all of these go into the waterways, but we are affecting all our native fauna that also depend on shorelines and waterways and fish, and of course orca are the top of the chain of that food chain that we see being impacted. So you can do this in your own property in many ways. This program actually is a wonderful way to access it. So we're trying to prevent all of that stuff from going into the waters around us and just being absorbed naturally into the garden. And then of course, the fewer things you use on your garden care, the better. All right, next. This is a fabulous slide that shows the difference between native plants and invasive plants. And we're going to talk a lot about native landscaping because the program, of course, is about putting natives back in place of where you've had, impervious surfaces. So native plants root much more deeply than invasives do. Invasive plants, many of them are colonizing plants, which is why they're so competitive. So something like Scotch broom actually can add nitrogen to the soil, but it can be a succession plant, but it doesn't go very easily, and it doesn't let other things grow. And some of them have what we call allelopathic effects, which they actually inhibit other plants from growing around them. Some of them are just really bad for wildlife. Butterfly bush, sounds great. And it does get lots of butterflies, adult butterflies, but it does nothing for the larvae of our native butterflies, which actually depend on a lot of willow species along stream banks. And butterfly bush displaces that. So we're hoping to get more people to use native plants, which you know, again, if everybody's doing this in their garden, you are providing food and shelter and nesting area for many native insects and birds. Next. So the eligible areas would include a lawn. Many people, have lots and lots of lawn. And I think part of it is it's easy to take care of, in a sense, because you can just mow it and you don't have to weed. You don't have to bend over either. I was thinking about this the other day. As I get older, it's like I can appreciate that, oh, I just have to run this mower across the lawn, and then I don't have to get on my hands and knees. But lawns can be impervious surfaces, especially if they are not taken care of properly. Many people don't grass cycle. They don't return anything to the lawn. And so it becomes, this space becomes very devoid of nutrient, and also doesn't let water get through it, and can be a just a runoff site where water just runs off the lawn. And then of course, hardscapes are, they're not letting water through. They've paved over. A lot of people, newer patios and things are built with more drainage through them. But, even better is to put a garden in that's going to function more naturally. And then the invasive weeds, which, we talked a little bit about with the Scots broom, but there are a lot of plants that grow in the Northwest that just take over, displace native plants, don't play nice, smother trees. Like this ivy can grow up a tree and start to strangle it over time. Birds, when it becomes mature and it flowers and fruits, birds spread those everywhere. Okay, next. So when you're converting to native landscaping, you're going to remove any of those three things: your lawn, your hardscape, or your invasive plants. And then with the program parameters, they want you to till 6 to 8 inches in. So we're trying to break up that soil. And the reason for this is all three of those kinds of scenarios, as I mentioned with the grass, like I pulled grass out where it's just dry soil underneath and it's compacted. It's never being nourished. Hardscapes, of course, it's compacted. Invasive plants, the same thing happens. So the goal of this is to try to sort of jumpstart your soil to get it loosened, to get that bottom layer of soil sort of chunked into, so that it can actually start to function as a place for water to move. You're going to mix in 3 inches of compost, you're going to plant, and then you're going to add a whole bunch of mulch. And so you're going to hear some similar things as we talked to with the rain garden, but now we're talking about just garden areas, places around your home. You don't have to dig, do the excavation. You're just mixing soil to create a new garden area and using a lot of native plants. Okay. So here's one of the easiest ways to remove a lawn. It's just called sheet mulching. You take cardboard, newspaper, you lay it over itself. It's ideal if you can like cover all the corners, don't leave any gaps. Grass is very persistent and it will try to come back through. You don't have to dig it out. And what you're doing then is putting organic material over the top of it, smothering it from the light, and it dies underneath. And by doing that, you actually are putting nutrient into the soil, and it starts to help to loosen the soil, because again, like I mentioned, all those microorganisms are moving all this stuff that you put, all the organic matter you put over the soil, they're starting to pull it into the ground. If you've ever been weeding early in the spring and under say a deciduous plant, and there's a clump of leaves that's sort of sticking up out of the ground, often what you're seeing is worm activity, where they're pulling those leaves into the soil. They use them to line their little burrows. And so macroorganisms, microorganisms, all are going to help do this work for you. You want to soak this cardboard to get it wet so the stuff doesn't just roll off of it, especially if you're on a slight slope. You want to cover it in mulch or compost and mulch. And it depends on what you got going on there to begin with, what kind of soil. Usually it's a good idea to add that compost, but you could do it later. You could just mulch over the top of it just to get everything to be killed underneath. And then you got to wait long enough for it to die underneath before you start tilling and for that cardboard or newspaper to start to break down. super easy to do. You can get cardboard from lots of different sources. I know people who get it, like go down to Costco and get it, but usually it's pretty available. Amazon's everywhere and delivering things all the time. So next, you can take a sod cutter. This is a lot quicker. You can see how compact that soil is, and it's not just because he's running a sod cutter over it. It's just because soil is compact under a lawn. The downside of this, you don't get any nutrients from this grass dying if you sheet mulch over it. The upside is if you have a decent looking lawn, like he seems to, you know, somebody could take that and put it in somewhere else, or you could maybe use it, you know, another part of your yard. But what you want to know about a sod cutter is they're very heavy. You have to rent them, you know. It's hard to get rid of the sod. You can turn it over and build berms in your garden, but you have to cover it pretty well to keep the grass from keep trying to grow. And it's hard to dispose of it. They don't really want it in your yard waste cart, or they really don't want you to bring it to the transfer stations either. So it's much better just to sheet mulch, I think. But this is much quicker, especially if you want to plant right away. Okay. So then if you're removing hardscape, that's a bigger issue. You can contract out to get this stuff out. Those broken pieces of concrete, sometimes are very useful also to use to build, like you could build raised beds with them. You could build little walls with them. So, you know, reuse that material. You don't have to take it to the dump. It is hard. You need a good strong back. You can see some of the tools like crowbars and the big wedge that they're using there to do it. So keep that in mind. But removing hardscape is one of the best things you can do, especially if you don't use it, or it's old, it's cracked, it's, you know, like even in this area, it looks like it's sort of on a slope. So it's probably not even useful to like put a table and chair set out there. Next. So you want to remove invasive weeds, and we see pictures of many of our common friends here. The butterfly bush on the top left that I mentioned that takes over riparian areas. It's all up in the Issaquah Highlands on the woodland edges. It's really terrible. When I worked at City Light for many years as a gardener years ago, and we had a substation once that was up against a building, and the substation, this was a very small substation, and the fence around it, between the fence and the building behind it, was this little strip of land that you couldn't even walk into. It was only like 4 inches wide, and it was full of buddleia that was growing up through there and over and seeding into the yard of the substation, which we had to keep weed free. And they are copious amounts of seeds that they spread. Ivy, we all know ivy as a, you know, very common ground cover, but getting rid of that is super helpful. Some of the ways to do that is to like cover it. I have known people in natural areas. I had a neighbor once when I lived in Northeast Seattle who worked in the Thornton Creek area, Greenbelt, and she would take tarp and cover it for months. And then once it died underneath, you can actually literally roll it up, much easier than digging it out. But that's also time consuming. Himalayan blackberry, you know, digging that out. There are actually weed wrenches you can use to pull that out of the ground if you get into big heavy stems, but you have to get all the roots out. Holly is a tree that goes where the roots go very deep. Sometimes that's helpful to have somebody like grind the stump on. The Scots broom also has that deep tap root, again, a colonizer. The bindweed, bottom left picture, also a colonizer, very deep roots. The vinca in the purple flower, that is a ground cover that was, you know, introduced probably in the 60s as this beautiful Northwest landscape feature. But if it's in really deep shade, it sometimes behaves itself, but it can just take over, and it runs a little bit underground, but mostly on the surface. So it's a lot of digging out. The pink flower on the left middle section, that's herb Robert or stinking Robert, and that's an annual, much easier to pull, but it puts out seeds everywhere, and displaces, all of these displace native vegetation. And then of course our arch enemy on the bottom right, the bindweed, or what we call morning glory. And there's two types, one that grows upright more and one that grows more flat on the ground. Both of these have underground stems that go everywhere. I've had success with sheet mulching areas where it's growing really thickly, which tricks it into coming up higher into the soil. All those underground stems come up a little higher because it thinks it's deeper in the soil, trying to find light. And then you have more material to pull out. Terrible. All of these are really destructive plants in the Northwest. Next. So ideal times to remove these are late fall or winter or early spring. You want to you're going to get more motion when the ground is wet. Of course, you don't want to be out there when it's frozen. That's not great for the soil anyway, to be on it when it's frozen. You want to make sure that you're not affecting native bees, which do a lot of underground nesting. Typically, they're not going to be in a big pile of these, but they could be depending on the environment. If it's a slopey hill and it's rocky, you might have a bumblebee nest in it. And you might actually run into yellow jackets as well, which is why, later is better. Early spring is probably ideal for areas you might be worried about that. And also many of these weeds have died back, so you can get into them. Not that the ivy, of course, is evergreen, but you can get to them more easily. So you're going to till down to 8 inches or until you hit hard pan. You might need to sort of, do this over and over again. It means you're getting at the top layer, and then once you loosen that up, push that aside and then go deeper and then do it again. So you're trying to get down deeper than usually the tines of the small rototiller, and making sure that you're getting that depth in there and getting all of it loose. It's kind of, it's very easy to not get it fully mixed if you don't do it this way, if you don't pull soil aside and then do it again. Okay, next. And you're going to work in the compost into the tilled soil. If you have clay or sandy soil, you want to add more. So sandy soil drains really well, but it could drain too much and it doesn't have as much nutrient. And then clay soil has smaller pore spaces, doesn't drain as well, and compost will help open that up and break it open. Again, those microorganisms are helping you to do that work. So you add more if you have really sort of pure clay or pure sand, to get your soil at a bit more of a loamy mix. You're shooting for a nice blend of soil. And compost has, and remember, compost is made with a lot of different things depending on where you get it from. Some of it is also has animal manures in it, so that's going to add a lot of nutrient. But in the Northwest, in our area, we see a lot of compost coming from our yard waste program, so there's a lot of organic matter in there that's going to help to break that up. Okay, so goals for the garden. You're trying to create a garden area that's going to soak up rainwater. So that's your number one concern. That's what you're thinking about when you're planning this. That's why you're tilling so deep. That's why you're adding the compost. That's why you removed all that stuff to begin with. And in this program, you want to make sure that you're picking at least 50% of the plants are native. And, I think you can, do that easily. There's so many beautiful native plants. You might want a garden to attract wildlife, like this hummingbird here. They love like the red flowering currants that are blooming or just stopping, actually just finishing now, starting to turn into berries. But that's a good early food for them. The Mahonia, the Oregon grape with the bright yellow flowers that was blooming in March, that's also a good early food for them. Also turns into fruit for other birds. You can create a low maintenance garden using native plants. A lot of native plants don't have a lot of disease or pest issues. That's not to say that they're completely free of them. They aren't always. Oregon grape can get powdery mildew on it, but the healthier your environment is, if you have it in a good spot, it's less likely to be affected by it. You can also grow native berries like huckleberries and then use them to harvest. But remember that your goal of this garden is for it to drain. You don't want to be walking all over it. So, you're going to build some, small pathways that you can use to walk through to get to that berry. Or if you're building a contemplation area where you might want to put a bench in to sit and look at your beautiful garden, you want to put in something so that you're not compacting the soil. So just walk in the, it's like when you go hiking, walk where you're supposed to walk and don't tromp in the natural areas. Next. So plant selection is a huge thing. There's so many different things and everybody has so many different desires and tastes in plants. But most of all, you need to think about what a plant needs. So what are the light levels that any particular plant likes? What is the light level of the section of the garden that you're creating on your property? What are its watering needs and for how long? And is it going to need a lot of water? Many native plants don't. Something like Dicentra that we see on the top, the bleeding heart, the native bleeding heart, it's an ephemeral plant. It comes up, it blooms, it's blooming right now, and then it's going to die back and you're not going to see it much of the summer. It's going to just sort of fade away. And so you don't need to worry about it too much. It's great for under deciduous trees where it gets more light. And then when the tree leaves out, the plant is disappearing anyway. You want to space your plants properly so that they have enough room to grow and you're not creating areas where diseases can build up because they're too thickly planted and there's no air circulation. And you want to create a multi-layered diverse garden, partially because it looks better. So you don't want to think about something like when you're designing, you don't want it to be just a fence line, not a straight line of plants. You want to make it multidimensional, have plants sitting at in different spaces so that you have more of a sort of forest setting or a garden, a natural setting. But multi-layered and diverse gardens also help you to attract more wildlife. So if you are interested in wildlife, having canopy that's high, low, medium is better because especially with birds, they occupy all different parts of that landscape. You want your plants to mature in place. You don't want to do a lot of pruning on them. You want them to be natural. You want to know how wide and how tall they actually get. And so you're also going to be amending the soil nicely, and they may exceed the, what the normal 10-year goal is on how big a plant gets. So plant techs can tell you that. People that you talk to when you buy plants can tell you that. Books can usually tell you that when you read about them. And you want to think about where you're viewing it from. So sometimes there are gardens that are, not sitting out with complete 360 access around them. And so you're only looking at them from one perspective, maybe when you walk up to them from coming off the street into the house. But they might be a planting bed in the middle of a yard where from one side you're looking at one thing and maybe it's shading and maybe that's your sitting area. And from the other side, you're looking out your kitchen window at it. And then what are you seeing? And so kitchen window view is especially a great place to think about what blooms in the winter. What kind of bark do you see in the winter? What are the color schemes that you're going to see? What does it look like in the fall? Think about seasonality, how the plants look. Deciduous plants like this 9-bark that's on the bottom picture here. They flower in the summer. They have these wonderful flowers attractive to a lot of pollinators. And then they have these cute little maple-like leaves, and then they're a green shrub for most of the summer. Birds like to gather in them. They're a great place for them to take shelter, to protect themselves. And then they get some fall color, and then they drop their leaves, and they have this beautiful sort of striated bark in the wintertime. So that might be a plant that you want to be looking at most of the time and not just sort of hidden away. There's evergreen plants, they're deciduous. Many of them are ephemeral, like the bleeding heart. And I want to point out, I want to make a special plug for deciduous native plants and shrubs, because these are really beautiful. There are really a lot of beautiful deciduous shrubs that people don't know very much about, like the 9-bark, like ocean spray, like the red stem dogwood. All of those are really beautiful for a garden. They're good landscape plants. and they're wonderful wildlife plants. So want to encourage you to add them to the mix. And also because a garden looks better when it has diversity of leaf shape and different things happening over the seasons and different things blooming at different times. So remember that this is not a place to like put your vegetable garden. You know, it's not a site where you want to be walking around in it a lot. You're trying to create an area that is actually doing service to, you know, to the earth by sequestering storm water and taking the water in. You can interact with it, but be aware of how you're interacting so that you have minimal impact on the soil. Next.
Thanks, Laura. And just a quick time check. We've just got about a minute left of our regularly scheduled or our anticipated schedule. So we'll hit the high notes from here on out to make sure that hopefully folks can stick around for a few extra minutes so we can answer your questions.
So the native plants, we're blessed with lots of native plant resources in the Northwest. This list, King County Native Plant website, the Washington Native Plant Society, all of these are places to find great plant lists, but also places to get ideas and to think. Go visit local nurseries. The picture at the bottom is Federation Forest State Park, out in Enumclaw area. You have a native plant garden there. Just there's lots of places to learn. So be aware of how to find information. And then next. So here's some ideas of plants that I've been talking about. So color, lots of color. Camas is a beautiful grassy plant that comes up and has that beautiful blue flower on it in the springs. That would be something that would be blooming soon. And then it's ephemeral, it dies back. Douglas spirea is very tall, likes wet areas. The juncus, these are things that would grow more in wetland areas. The Douglas spirea we don't encourage in a rain garden because it spreads too much, but think about it if you have wet soil. And then the wildlife plants, a lot of things with a lot of fruit. Twinberry, the snowberry has beautiful white berries, lots of strawberry, native strawberries too. So King County has sample planting plans on their website. You can actually create a plant list that can be emailed to you. You just, you know, set it up online and then it gets emailed to you. So you don't have to take notes, you take them through the website. But lots of great planting plans that you can adapt for your garden. Next. Again, we're back to adding mulch. So make sure that you mulch where you plant. This is super important for the health of the plant. Helps keep weeds down, helps moderate that soil temperature, and will keep your plants healthy. Okay. And then estimating costs, you know, what you need to think about if you have the right tools, what are the materials you're going to need? Look for things that are free, like the wood chips. Other material costs, of course, plants, you know, have a cost. There are some native plant nurseries. You can also go through like the different conservation districts have native plant sales where they sell smaller plants, but you do want to get big plants into this garden. But you need to like think about what all the things would be.
Great. Laura, do you want me to jump in from here?
Sure.
For the rest of the costs? Thanks. Okay. Laura and I went back and forth on how to cover this. So I will just say I'm speaking from the perspective of the program, which is why we decided maybe I should take on some of these slides. So just really quickly, the biggest thing that's going to impact the total cost is whether you are doing this work yourself or you're hiring a contractor. The program allows for both, and you can also, you know, hire out certain portions with a contractor and do other elements yourself. I'm happy to talk through these options with you and help you, you know, sort of figure out what would be the best fit for you. So as Laura mentioned, there's a few elements of, you know, when I'm pricing things out, what do I need to think about? So tool rentals, each project is going to be slightly different. You can use hand tools in some cases. It's going to increase the amount of time and labor into the project. but it will save money. So these are approximate costs, just, from some local businesses. You should not, bet on these costs for sure. Always call and get the actual cost from the vendor. I do have a worksheet with this information as well that I'll include in the follow-up email because this is helpful for pricing it out. Landscaping materials, of course, we talked about that rain garden soil blend, compost, and woody mulch. Laura pointed out that you can get arborist chips for free. I think that's a really important resource, especially with long-term maintenance. And then, of course, too, recycling old soil. If you don't have a way to get rid of that for free, you're not going to use it in the landscape or put it on Craigslist. If you do have to dispose of it, it has a cost associated with it. And then for the rain garden itself, the inlets and the outlets and those different features will have some costs too. So again, it just sort of depends on exactly how you choose to create that, but you'll want to factor those costs in. Laura touched on the plants. I will just say, larger versus smaller, we're pretty flexible. What we want to see is over time plants are establishing. Some people prefer to start with larger plants, which of course cost more, but it gives you that more sort of full landscape feel, I guess, or an established landscape feel from the start. I'm sure Laura has a lot of thoughts on which plants would be better to get larger and which would be better to get smaller. Bare root plants are also a great option, especially for trees. They tend to transplant even better sometimes than potted ones. Laura will have to have a follow-up just on like this type of which plants to choose at what stage. Laura touched on the wholesale versus resale and some of the places that you can get plants too. Let's just hope for not another June heat wave. So really quickly diving into the Stoke It Up rebate program, I just want to talk about the eligibility. So by now, we offer rebates for rain gardens and native landscapings. And so these are a great way to make over your garden and also to give back to the environment. They can also help to solve some drainage issues that you might be experiencing. Really, I can help you identify what could be a good fit for your yard and what would be eligible under the program during a site consultation, which is the first step to participating in this program. I am going to just graze through this slide since Laura hit on it so well, but again, this is what a rain garden is. You might choose to install a rain garden because you're experiencing a drainage issue from a downspout or from a hardscape running off into an area. You might want to have an area to filter pollutants, maybe from your driveway, or maybe you have an old sort of roof system that is full of pollutants that you want to filter out instead of sending it to the road. You're going for those environmental benefits of reducing those intense flows and reducing pollution. Maybe you just like the look of them. They're very Pacific Northwest. They fit well here. They can be designed to be pretty low maintenance, and they can increase wildlife habitat within your own yard and pollinator habitat. Native landscaping. So this can help with some drainage issues caused by compacted soils, as opposed to a downspout issue or area that has water coming in from the hardscape. Again, low maintenance, aesthetically pleasing, and really beneficial to wildlife and pollinators. The rebate is based off of, for the rain garden, $2.50 for each square foot of contributing area. So that's that hardscape that's flowing into the rain garden. For the native landscape, it's $2.50 for every square foot converted. We offer rebates from $1,000 to $2,000, and that is 400 square feet to 800 square feet of garden. Important eligibility information: you need to be a property owner in the city of Shoreline. It can be a commercial property or residential property. The project must be at least 400 square feet. The rebated area can't be in the right-of-way. It's got to be on your property. Sometimes it's surprising where the property line is. I can help you figure out that information. Again, a site consultation is best to determine this. Also, we cannot be doing work under the canopy of trees. As Laura mentioned, we're working outside of the drip line because we don't want to be harming those roots, which are already doing so much to manage stormwater. This program does require a 10-year maintenance covenant and stays with the title of the house. So if you are to sell your house in this crazy market right now, it would go on to the next homeowner. The maintenance covenant allows us to come in every 2 years and make sure that the garden is still in place and that the plants are establishing, it's being maintained. We've never had to take back a rebate. That's the other element of the rebate, is if you choose to remove it before its 10-year duration, then we will request those funds back. But we've never had to do this, and I really hope that we never have to do this either. All of our program policies are in our program overview and application. And then for the rain garden, since there are a lot more site specifics about the setbacks, we use the rain garden handbook for those. And of course, we're looking for at least 50% native plants. Some places are in critical areas, so if you're close to a stream, and there are going to be additional requirements for that. Again, this is something that I will help you with during a site consultation to determine if you're in one of these areas and these rules apply to you. Program process. So first step is to schedule that site visit with me or a site consultation just to determine if your property is eligible and what projects could work on there. After we determine that eligibility, then we ask that you submit that application. Really importantly, please do not start any work whatsoever. You can test your infiltration rate, but don't go removing the grass if you plan on applying for a native landscaping project. Make sure you submit that application first. I turn those applications around really quick, typically within 2 business days. I'll let you know if I need a little bit more time. Once you get that approval, you can begin and complete the project, and then I'll come back out just to make sure that the project, once it's complete, matches that application that we put together. And then we'll bring you into City Hall to sign the covenant, and within 3 to 6 weeks of signing the covenant, you will receive your rebate check in the mail. All right. That was a blow through in the end, but I am here to answer any questions at any point about the program. And we've also got Laura here this evening to answer more questions about rain gardens and native landscaping and plant selection. So I do see we have 2 questions in the chat that I wanted to save towards the end. And Laura, I thought that you would be a good person to talk on these. Melody had asked, do we need to replace the soil of a rain garden once it has absorbed enough chemicals?
That's a great question. And we've, when people first start building rain gardens in their Northwest, and Curtis was working on all this initially, those were all things they were looking at and thinking about. Because the point is that it does absorb toxins, but a lot of these things break down over time. So like hydrocarbons will, dissipate. It's just that they're staying in place, which is great because they're not going into the water. Things to biodegrade need to be in the soil. And so they're not going to biodegrade as easily if they just flow out into the water. They just pollute the water. Metals, even some metals will stay, but there are some changes that can even happen with metals that can change the toxicity of them. So there's still research going on about that, and nobody to date has had to replace any soils out of these types of plantings.
Thank you, Laura. Another question from Chelsea. She has never sheet mulched before, and she's wondering after 3 months if the cardboard has broken down or if it needs to be removed before tilling the soil.
If you water that really well before you cover it, and it's an area that is exposed to rain, it will break down pretty quickly. If it's in a really dry space, it may be being shadowed by a fence or, a building that, maybe breaks the rain a little bit. Remember, you're not putting things like under trees, which would definitely be a dry area. It might take a little bit longer, but usually pretty quickly. You can use newspaper, which breaks down faster, and that works just as well. But yes, it breaks down. I've done this many times. I did it in my old yard to get rid of a grass area that was under the shade, in the shade, and it was gone within a couple months. And the soil also got nice and soft underneath there. It was beautiful.
I am I have a mulching project going on right now, and I've had mine out for about 5 months now, I think 4 or 5 months. And I will say that there is a little bit of cardboard left, but nothing that if you were to run a tiller over it, the tiller wouldn't notice. It's really broken down at this point. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, but I do want to open it up if folks would like to ask any questions live. I think you should be able to have the raise hand function in order to ask a question. I see, there we go, Maureen, go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself, Maureen.
There you're, oh. You were unmuted for a second. Maureen, do you want to?
We lost her.
Oh,
Okay. Well, maybe she'll be able to rejoin. If anybody has a question and would like to put it into the Q&A or would like to attempt to unmute themselves, then please. Well, I will just say thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is a lot of information, but I hope that it was really informative to you and helped you to build up a bit more confidence around developing plans for these gardens and installing them. I am here to help with every step of the way. So I, of course, support our Soak It Up program participants, but you should feel free to use me as a resource to ask me questions and, you know, try to get some more information, whether it's choosing plants or, you know, finding whatever it is really you need, sizing the garden, any element that you're running into that's tripping you up, I would be happy to help. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I will say thank you one more time, both to Laura, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and to all of you. Thank you so much.